There was a time in my life when things were really bad. Like I was homeless and living as a vagabond, getting food from trash cans and begging people for change. Kind of bad. This was a long time ago, and I'm doing a lot better in life now. But at this point my life was really low. And while some people may say I was hallucinating or just seeing things, I wasn't a stereotypical homeless person. I didn't do any sort of drugs. I didn't drink. I just struggled to get through every day. And what led me to being homeless was out of my control. I'm not going to get into all of that, because it's not really important. But I will say that I was basically living in a rust bucket with 4 wheels that barely ran. Back when this happened, most cities weren't really bothered by people sleeping in their cars like they are today. And so long as you were out of the way and not bothering anyone, you could pretty much stay where you were for the night and no one would care. Back then, because I was sleeping in my car, I typically tried to park it somewhere that was away from people and wouldn't be an issue for anyone. There was one spot I liked specifically that was in a small suburban area that was only sort of incorporated. It was mostly residential, and there were woods that pretty much surrounded the streets. Like there were a good amount of houses, but if you kept going, there was an area that was just a road with trees on both sides. I could go to the area that didn't have houses, and I'll pull over and park on the side of the road as close to the trees as I could. And that's where I would essentially camp out. It almost felt like actually camping, to be honest with you, because it was surrounded by the trees, and I was safe in my little car. So I tried to hold on to that optimism and make the most out of it. That is until the event this story is about happened. I'd been camping there for a couple of weeks, just thankful I had a bit of stability in my depressing circumstance. On that night, I had actually managed to get a few dollars together, so I'd gotten a Big Mac from McDonald's and a small soda, so I was honestly happy as could be. It was around 9 at night, and I was just sitting there, savoring my meal, when I noticed what looked like a deer in a small clearing in the woods. I'd seen a few deer in this area, so it wasn't really surprising. But I also like deer, so I was thinking that this is going to be an even better of a night. When you're in a bad situation, the simple things mean a lot, honestly. As the deer started walking through the woods and getting closer to where I was, I started to see that there was something wrong with it. At first, I thought it had some sort of parasite or something. I'd read about those kind of things. But I quickly realized it wasn't a parasite. Whatever was wrong with this thing was really wrong. As it got closer, I was able to see that it looked like the skin was actually falling off its face. Like I could see part of its jawbone from where its flesh was near literally melting off its face. It took me a minute to really realize what the hell was happening. I was trying to mentally piece together that maybe it had been attacked and was dying. But no, the skin wasn't just falling off like it had been ripped into. It was melting. And it wasn't only its face. It was all over its head, legs, and midsection. Its antlers were sharp pointed and were also broken, and looked like they had some kind of skin hanging off them. I was thinking that if this was a deer, it was really messed up from something. But after a few moments, I came to be certain that it was not a deer. As it stepped through the woods, this thing got toward a tree and slowly pulled itself up onto its hind legs and started scratching at the tree with its hooves. As though they weren't really hooves. They looked more like claws. This zombified deer, monster thing was standing there, its flesh falling off the bone and clawing at the base of a tree. For God knows what reason. I genuinely have no idea what this thing was, but I immediately started my car and drove off. I was not going to deal with whatever the hell this monster was. I had nothing to protect myself or to fight this monster if it decided it wanted to come and get me. And I wasn't going to die by some melting deer monster. I wish I had a camera with me at the time, or that this was when camera phones were a common thing, because I cannot properly explain how disgustingly terrifying this thing really was. And if I had a picture of it, maybe I could get someone out there to hunt it and kill it, because this thing was not natural. If it was a deer, then the only word I can think to describe it is zombified. And the fact that its hooves look more like claws to me tells me that this thing was something else altogether. Obviously, I never went back to that area. Ever. I never camped out there again. And I pretty much kept a parking lot when I was still sleeping in my car. I thankfully did get through this hard time, and things are better now. But I will never forget the night I saw this horrifying beast. And I'm just glad I've never seen anything like that again. This experience is one I've kept to myself for a long time, and I've always wanted to put it out there. But I've always had this concern of people telling me I was lying or was making it up. I will say that I'm not making this up at all. It may sound like a crazy story, but it is something that happened to myself and my cousin when we were much younger. I'm not much of a writer, so if this story feels stiff, I apologize. But I'll try my best to make this detailed and written well enough. This is the story of the night that my cousin and I believe we ran into the Jersey Devil out in the Pine Barrens. As I have said, I was spending time with my cousin back when I was about 20. While I was there, we made plans to go on a camping trip as a way to wrap up our summer, as is only natural when you're part of New Jersey. I had told him that I wanted to spend a few nights in the Pine Barrens, an area notorious for those urban legends about how creepy the woods can be. We were fully aware of all the stories about the Jersey Devil, but being that age, and with him having lived there, we all thought that it was just a joke or story told to kids to keep us out of the woods. We got to our destination, a spot that was a bit secluded, far away from other campers, and we settled in for the night. The first day was great. We did some hiking, cooked up our food over a small fire, and we turned in pretty early. The second day, we spent a lot of time outside enjoying the weather, and we had broken out our case of beer so that we could party a bit over the campfire. That was, honestly, the overall plan of the trip. I was 20, my cousin was 22, so we planned on going out into the woods to get drunk and have a good time. That night, we started drinking and sitting around the campfire, and my cousin started telling me about his plans for college, how he got a scholarship for whatever sport it was he played. And in the middle of his sentence, we both paused and looked out into the trees. The silence of the forest was broken by a strange sound, a high-pitched scream mixed in with a low growling sound. When we both heard it, I mentioned it was probably a wounded fox, that they make some really creepy sounds. And it was most likely just that. My cousin laughed and said it was creepy as hell. And then we heard it again, except this time, the high-pitched tone was less prominent, and the growling was louder. I said that we should probably just go ahead and get to sleep. Part of me just wanted to ignore the sound and not think about it. My cousin agreed, and we got in the tents and went to sleep. After a bit, I did doze off, but I was woken up by that same sound again, probably an hour or so later. I heard it and my eyes shot open, like an instinctual reaction to the sound. Like my body was telling me, hey, you need to wake up and be scared. I just stayed there on the sleeping bag for a few seconds, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, thinking about whether or not this thing was actually a threat. When I started hearing footsteps near the tents, I glanced over to where I thought they were coming from, and sure enough, there was something there. The steps were a bit heavy as this thing approached. I started to get hit with heavy fear when I saw a hand like appendage start pressing against the fabric of the tent, almost like it was rubbing it, trying to figure out what it was. The fabric crinkled and folded slightly as this thing was pushing against the walls and then the top. I just sat there thinking, it'll lose interest. It'll walk away. Thankfully, it did lose interest after a while, and it did start stepping away. At that point though, I had to know what the hell it was, and when I was satisfied it was a good distance away, I unzipped my tent to see if I could find this creature. To my surprise, my cousin was already standing outside of his tent, pale as a ghost under the moonlight. It was at that point that I realized that this wasn't just a normal creature, nor it was something I was imagining. He had seen it very clearly. I saw this thing too, but he saw it in much better detail. What I saw was a very tall, beast-like thing covered in matted fur, and I swear this thing had wings that were tucked in. My cousin added 2 details to this to make me think that this thing was the Jersey Devil. He said it had glowing eyes that he saw as it walked away, and he claimed it had legs with knees that shifted backwards, like a goat. I can't make that claim, as I didn't see its eyes, nor did I really see its legs in detail. But this thing was not a normal animal. That much I am certain of. Unfortunately, it was the middle of the night, and we were both a bit tipsy, so driving away wasn't a good idea. We both made a conscious decision to start our fire back up, and just wait the night out, and then drive away when we were sobered up in the morning. When the sun came up, we got our stuff together and got the hell out of Dodge. To this day, I'm certain of what we encountered that night was the infamous Jersey Devil. I can't explain what it was, or why it chose to check our little camp out like it had, but I'm grateful it didn't go any further, or decide it wanted us, and not just to check the tents out. I know nothing really happened to us, thankfully, but it was still a scary moment. That was the only time we camped out in the Pine Barrens, and I will never forget that thing, whether it was a Jersey Devil or not. I used to spend a lot of my summer vacation at my grandparents' house, which was essentially a small farm in the middle of nowhere. And as much as I love my grandparents, I used to also get really bored. I used to go out and explore some of their land, and would oftentimes go out into the forest that lined their property, despite the fact that my grandma would tell me I need to stay close to the house. One year I had ventured out, and found what was basically a small cave near the property line, and I loved it. It was a really small cave, like large enough for me to fit comfortably in when I was about 10, and that was about it. It was large enough for an adult to climb into, but was rather cramped, and it wouldn't be comfortable for anyone larger than a child to stay in for more than a few minutes. I had actually painted part of one of the walls with my name and some random things, just to mark it as mine basically. It was dumb, but it was my little home away from my grandparents' farmhouse. As I got into my older teen years, I stopped going to my grandparents' house as frequently, mostly because my parents were more okay with me staying home alone. I hadn't gone to the farmhouse for a few years by the time this all happened. As a matter of fact, about a decade ago, my grandfather passed away, so I actually spent several days with my grandmother at the house to keep her company and make sure she was doing okay. On one of the days while I was staying with her, I wanted to walk the property, and after a while, I remembered my little cave, and I wanted to go see if it was still there, or if it had been taken over by nature. I head out to the northern corner of the land, jump the fence, and head out into the woods, toward where the cave was. After a few moments of fumbling with the location, I actually find where the opening was, and was excited it was still there. The next part was the difficult part, which was me trying to figure out if I could get into the cave at all without getting stuck. After thinking it through, I decided I could pretty much get half my body in if I turned the right way. And from there, I will be able to see if my name was still painted on the wall. I get down and start to twist myself in, and as soon as I get my head into the cave, I start to smell something putrid. It was pretty obvious that something had died in there, which was disappointing, but I just assumed it would be a possum or a raccoon or something that had scurried away to die in the cave. It was gross, but it wasn't going to stop me from seeing if this was still my cave. I get my head in, and what I saw was horrifying. It wasn't just a small dead animal. It was numerous dead animals, like dozens of carcasses that were lined up on the back wall. There was also what looked like children's clothing piled off to the side, and what looked like an old doll sitting on top of the clothes. At this point, I was out. I pushed myself out of the cave, not even caring if it was still marked, because something was staying in this cave, and I didn't want to know what the hell it was. As most scary stories go though, it didn't just end with dead bodies in the cave. As soon as I pushed myself out, I started hearing what sounded like growling or hissing. I stood up and looked around, but didn't see whatever it was that was so angry with me until I looked up. I have no idea what the hell the thing was that looked about 200 feet away from me, standing in one of the trees and angrily growling at me. It looked human-like, but it 100% was not human. I took off, thinking that this creature was going to chase me, but about halfway to the fence, I looked back and saw this thing actually crawling on the ground toward the cave, which made this all worse. This thing was whatever was living there and storing its spare carcasses there. I just kept running toward the house and decided I would forget this thing ever existed. I never mentioned it to my grandma, and unfortunately she passed away that same year, and the estate was sold, so I have no way of going back to see if that thing was still there, and I never got the chance to go back with a camera or anything. I really do not know what I saw, but it looked like some kind of feral, human-like monster. But it wasn't large. It was almost childlike. It was small enough to live in that cave. It was nimble enough to climb and stand in a tree as it growled at me. It was seriously creepy as hell, and I hope I never see anything like it again. And I hope that whoever owns that property now never had to deal with it. Growing up, there was something special about summers at my parents' house in rural Pennsylvania. They had an old farmhouse, one that was tall and proud in the rolling green field with the backdrop of a dense forest. It was a place where my little brother, Josh, and I would spend way too many hours adventuring out and playing dumb games. When we got out of school for the summer, Our parents would drop us off, and we would spend the couple months out there, helping our grandparents out where they needed us. They owned a pretty decent-sized property. They had the fields and the animals, and the backwoods behind the property had a charming little creek that ran through a lower section of the land. It kind of snaked its way through the back corner of the property, and we spent a lot of the hotter days in the creek. It wasn't too deep and didn't have too much of a current, so we would wade into it and splash around. Sometimes we would find tadpoles or neat rocks we would collect and keep. Sorry for the tangent, but honestly, the innocence of those days are something I've missed as I've gotten older. There was one day one summer that I remember being blisteringly hot. I was about 12 at the time, which would have put Josh at around 8. The afternoon sun had turned the day into an absolute oven, and the creek was calling us. Once we finished helping our grandmother clean up the home, we asked if we could go out and swim in the creek, and she told us to go have a good time. We jumped into our swimming trunks and ran down to the creek as quickly as we could. We'd been splashing around for a while, just having a great time with each other and enjoying the cool waters. Around then is when I thought I'd seen something a bit down the way in the stream. There was something that was there, but I couldn't really tell what it was. We typically only ever swam around this spot on the creek, mostly because we didn't want to leave the property, but I was curious and intrigued on what was out there. So, as little boys do, I took the initiative to investigate what this thing in the creek with us was. Josh, of course, followed closely behind. The closer we got to this thing, the more it dawned on me that I really didn't know what the hell this thing was. This thing was decently sized. At first, I thought it could have been a giant rat of some kind, or a beaver. I don't even know if beavers live in Pennsylvania, but I just remember thinking that beavers were large and weird looking. We kind of pushed over to the side of the creek as we got a bit closer, just watching this thing do whatever it was doing in the water. The closer we got, the more I noticed that this thing wasn't really rat-like. It looked more like a hunched-over person. You know how Gollum would crouch down in Lord of the Rings? It looked like that, except covered in a coarse fur like a rat. It did have some parts that weren't covered in fur, like the hands and the face, and I could see that it had this weird, grey-green leathery skin. Its arms looked like they were too long for its body. Its fingers ended in hook-like claws that were short, but still looked deadly. We just stood there watching this thing, as it seemed to forage through the pebbles in the creek bed, picking up one every once in a while, and then tossing it back down. Then, it looked over in our direction. This thing had a face that honestly haunts me. It was dominated by these large, bulbous eyes that were pitch black. It had a small mouth filled with teeth, and it was moving it non-stop, like it was speaking, but it wasn't making any noise. Seeing it look at us, my initial curiosity and fascination were immediately replaced by fear. I could see that Josh was just as scared as I was. As we stared at it, and it stared at us, it dropped what it had in its hand, and seemed to move its attention to us. As soon as it started coming towards us, I stood up and started to step backwards, which seemed to scare it, like it was initially curious about us, but when we were no longer hunched over, it started to see us as a threat. It stopped approaching us and turned away, and we watched as this thing scurried out of the creek, and then darted into the dense underbrush that lines the stream. We stood there in what I can only call shocked silence, neither of us really even breathing as we just stare at where it had run off to. After a couple seconds, We both agreed that we need to get out of there and get home. We ran back to the farmhouse and we tried to explain what we had seen to my grandma, but she just laughed and told us it was probably just a squirrel or something. I can tell you that this thing was not a squirrel. This thing was some sort of creature that, to this day, I still cannot identify. The rest of that summer was different. The creek had lost its appeal and was no longer a place we wanted to spend time in. Every time we would talk about it, we both would be filled with the same thoughts. Like, what if that thing came back? We never did see this thing again, and we never figured out what it was. I've tried to see if it matched the description of anything that exists, but the only animal that looks even remotely close to are sloths. And this thing was not a sloth. It had similar coarse fur, and it had similar claws, but the face was all wrong, and it moved way too quickly. Even today, when Josh and I talk about our childhood, that thing is always brought up in conversations. Both of us can describe this thing in perfect detail, and we both have that same visual burned into our memories. I hope you enjoy this story. What did you think of it? Let me know what you thought in the comments section down below. Don't forget to stab the like button, subscribe, hit the bell and leave a comment. This video is made with the support of my incredible channel members, Patreon subscribers, and all my viewers. Thank you so much for supporting me. Don't forget to check out my social media accounts below, including my merch. Stay safe, my little spooklings. And remember, I'll be watching you.